Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katrina Tisdale and I will be your host for today's episode. Today we are joined by a student of the Science Communication program at Laurentian University whose main focus is biodiversity, more specifically the biodiversity crisis. She's here to tell us all about her research in the field. Welcome, Renata. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Before we discuss what you're currently studying, would you mind introducing our listeners to you and telling them a little bit about your educational background?
My name is Renata Brandt. I'm a biologist and I study biology at the University of São Paulo, where I also took my PhD in animal physiology.
What made you seek out a master's in science communication then?
So, while I was working as a postdoc at Auburn University, there was a lot of political mess going on back home in Brazil. So science funding was cut and scientists didn't have the support of our people to make their demands. So I felt like a connection between scientists and society was missing. So just as I got training to be a scientist, I felt like I should get training to be an effective science communicator to bridge this gap between scientists and society.
That's certainly admirable. I can definitely respect wanting to make sure that citizens are aware of what's happening and aware of what research is being conducted. Speaking of, would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about what you're studying for your master's thesis?
For my master's year at Laurentian, I will be working on figuring out what are the effects of being exposed to a broad taxonomic range of species on the zoo visitor understanding or knowledge of biodiversity. In other words, I want to understand if the strategy of keeping a broad range of species is an effective way to educate people and increase their understanding of biodiversity upon visiting a zoo.
I understand you'll be conducting this study at the Toronto Zoo in Toronto, Ontario. Why did you choose this zoo specifically?
It's the largest zoo in Canada with more than 5,000 animals, more than 460 species. As a member of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums and of the Canada's accredited zoos and aquariums, has a mission to promote conservation-centered education. And it's also conveniently located close to Sudbury.
I can tell this is a field you're passionate about, especially with your background in biology and animal sciences. Is there anything specific that made you want to study the general public's knowledge of biodiversity?
Yes. Yes, so I have always been passionate about connecting people with nature. So did you know that in Canada, 85% of the population is urban?
I did not know that.
So yes, it's a lot of people living in cities here. And increasing urbanization is a world trend, which ends up decreasing our chances of connecting with nature. And we know from research that people don't care about what they do not know. And this worries me a lot because there's a current biodiversity crisis going on, and we need to get people to our side and start caring more about it.
That's why that communication part of science communication is crucial, especially for studies like this one. Can you explain a bit more about what the biodiversity crisis is for our listeners, and why is it so important to care about right now?
So the biodiversity crisis is happening because of all of the fast modifications that we humans are imposing to our environments. Because of all of these modifications, an alarming number of species are being extinct or in the verge of being extinct if we don't start to use our environments in a more sustainable way. And with biodiversity, it is not so clear, but by the time we realize what's going on, it might be too late.
Do you think there's a larger draw for visitors to go seek out endangered species or species at risk when they're visiting a zoo?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting question because we know from research that visitors usually come to the zoo to see more charismatic and familiar species. Some of those are endangered, like the rhinos, but most of endangered species are actually mostly unknown to people.
Hopefully, through your studies, visitors will notice that there are more species than just those larger and those charismatic ones, as you've mentioned earlier. From what I understand, you'll be conducting your study with two types of groups. You'll be interviewing families that come in to the zoo before they actually do their visit, and you'll be interviewing a separate group of families after they visit the zoo on their knowledge of biodiversity and different species that they've seen. And you'll be comparing these two groups, correct?
Yeah, and I plan on comparing both groups so that I can infer if the visit to the zoo was effective in increasing people's understanding of biodiversity. And additionally, for the group that I'll interview after their visit, I'll ask them to fill a species card during their visit, and in this way I can estimate if their understanding of biodiversity is related to the number of different forms of species that they saw during their visit.
Since you're working with the Toronto Zoo to do this study, will you be sharing your results with them as well?
Oh yes, absolutely. And also as a scientist, it's also my duty, I think it's my duty and my goal to have it published.
That's wonderful, and I really hope it gets published. I wish you the best of luck with that. Is there anything else that you'd love to share with us about your project today?
Oh, I'm so excited to see the results. But also, I hope that we could get the listeners a little bit more aware of the biodiversity crisis themselves. And if they want to know more about it or about my research, that they look for me on Twitter or Instagram, because I'm very active on social media and I love talking about science on social media and interacting with people. You just have to look for my name. It's Renata Brandt.
Well, I will definitely be looking out for you, Renata, and I wish you the best with your study. I'm eagerly awaiting the results. Thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me here this afternoon, Katrina. It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining me in this episode of our podcast. My name is Katrina Tisdale. We've talked about biodiversity with Renata Brandt. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on our social media, and I hope you have a great day.